Chief Curator. On behalf of the board and the staff, we'd like to welcome you here today. We have the great privilege to be having Tony Oursler talk about his exhibition and walk us through all three of the galleries. I'm just going to give you a little brief introduction before we start and pass it over to Tony. Tony is a pioneer of installation and multimedia art since the late 1970s. He has developed an experimental and innovative practice that utilizes projection, optical devices, audio, video, and sculpture to move images away from the white wall and onto the unexpected surfaces or environments. Employing conceptual dramaturgy, VR, 3D, stop motion, and live action, Oursler draws inspiration from pop cultural and fringe phenomena while frequently referring to science and technological advances to create a dialogue between perception and communication. Fresh off his dynamic public art commission, Tears of the Cloud, which was on view on Riverside Park this past October, we are delighted to showcase Tony's work in the entire museum to delve into the subject of water and magical thinking as it relates to the East End. Water Memory features the first presentation of a new process of projection on mist that the artist has worked on creating and mastering over the past 18 years. Through his inventive technological approach, Oursler explores the ubiquitous elements of water as a repository for belief systems with references to the range of sea monsters, evil spirits, to cartography, and the claimed ability of water memory. Tony lives and works in New York City and on the North Fork, and he has just returned from a major commission in Tasmania. I do want to also thank our sponsors on page 2. We really want to thank our lead sponsor, Mark Haas Foundation, the co-sponsors Bluebird Philanthropies, Kathleen McDonough and Edward Berman, of the Rosencrantz Foundation and George Wells, additional exhibition support by Nina Yankwitz and Barry Holden. Free admission to the museum is sponsored by Landscape Design and BNB Bank, so please come often. A special thank you to Jenny and Trey and Laird and the Lehman Mobin Foundation. Sarah Levine is here, I know, today. Sarah, great, terrific. Thank you so much for all of their wonderful help. I want to say a personal thank you to Casey DeLean, the Curator Assistant Registrar, and Joe Brondo, the Technical Director, who oversaw the complete installation with Tony. Well, I was at my son's wedding, so I want to really thank them so much from the bottom of my heart for doing this. So please be careful because we do have projectors on the floor, so when we're walking around the room, just be aware. And when we get into the other room, we have the box that are made out of blown glass, so just be careful as you're walking around the room. So without further ado, Tony.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. So happy to be here at the Museum of Guildhall Museum and to in these amazing rooms that were. Yeah, okay, come closer, come closer. Yeah, so happy to be here in the hallowed halls of Guildhall, which were, when was this place redone?
Built in 1931, and then there was a renovation probably a
dozen years ago.
The floors are 1 year old.
Oh, the floors are 1 year old. Well, there's something just incredible about the way everything is preserved, yet kind of updated here, and that was one of the great feelings that transmitted into the space. You know, these lovely three spaces to work together with, and you know, a lot of my work comes out of research. If you're familiar with my artwork, I kind of delve into different topics and then see where it leads me, and that's the way I've been following my trajectory as an artist through many years. You know, whether it's through media culture and its relationship to pop cultural phenomenons like multi-personality inventory tests and multiple personality disorder and like that. And so I can probably just answer a few questions about my history for those of you who are new to my work. People often ask me, well, how did you start getting involved with video? And I'll say, well, I began as a painter and sculptor as a kid, and and then by the time I started to get serious about it, I felt like there was something missing, and it turned out that was the moving image, and so being a kind of member of what I guess would be the TV generation, and then where I grew up with the moving image in the house, which a lot of people here did, and then of course bridging into the internet age. And thinking about art, my generation thinks about art as a kind of a way of expressing ideas and interacting with the culture, in the sense that I'm kind of interested in the vernacular, and I thought it was kind of strange, when I was a young artist, that there wasn't more moving image present in video. I mean, in the museums and in art galleries and so forth. And since then, there's been an incredible arc where, videos come in and out of fashion, and now I think it's kind of out of fashion, but, some of us still toil away in it. And, but you can see the traces of, my interest in working with these kind of, squeezing these mediums inside out, So I've always been kind of taking the moving image and turning it into a still image, or vice versa, and like that. So that's just a little bit of background. And this particular project, as Christina mentioned in her lovely introduction, kind of came out of a long research project that I was doing related to the water systems around the Northeast, specifically the Hudson River, which I grew up on in a little town called Nyack. And do people know that town? Yeah, okay. And so that was the kind of inspiration to look at that, the river as a kind of metaphor, as a kind of cultural engine, as a metaphor for some of the kind of activities, whether they were narrative or engineering or pop cultural phenomenons along there. And so I kind of picked a lot of points along the Hudson that were important to me, and looked at, the invention of the computer chip, and basically the developments of telecommunication with the Morse code. And one of the great inspirations, if you follow the Hudson all the way up, you can kind of pinpoint, areas, whether it be West Point or Olana or Nyack, where Edward Hopper and Thomas Wilfred were. Do you all know Thomas Wilfred? All right. Well, that's one thing I can mention to you today, that you got to go home and look up Thomas Wilfred, because I didn't really know who he was, even though I was living in Nyack as a little kid when he was still alive. He was a guy who did kind of moving image kinetic light sculptures, and those of you who might be around 60 or so may remember there was a moving image kind of light display in the coat room, right near the coat room at MoMA until 1985, I think it was. Anyway, that was a Thomas Wilfred work, and he's since kind of re-emerged. He made these fantastic sculptures with ever-changing kind of light boxes anyway, he was also, as Joseph Cornell was from Nyack too. See, I'm bragging about my hometown. But I discovered Thomas Wilfred was from he lived in West Nyack, and he used to open his studio up to people. So I imagine when I was a kid, my mom probably took me in there. So I'm going to say that happened, but it's really made up. But anyway, so One of the great inspirations about this corridor, and I'm going to take a poetic license and connect the Hudson River as a pathway, leading up to the Adirondacks, and the Hudson River School of Painters, who you may have heard of. People heard of them? Yeah, okay, great. So the Hudson River School was landscape painters that were inspired by, obviously, the Hudson River and a kind of bucolic, idyllic landscape. And there were kind of two sides to it. With my work, there's always a couple of sides to things. And with the Hudson River School, there was certainly a downside to the fact that the painters largely ignored the people who were here before them and painted idyllic landscapes that America could identify with, but as basically a kind of heavenly transcendental space for kind of projection of the immigrants who came from Europe and landed in New York area and came all along the shores of the East Coast and kind of painted these wonderful landscapes which stirred, the burgeoning countries, stirred the enthusiasm for the potential of the lands of America, ignoring the fact that we were all immigrants coming to this land and that there were people already living here for millions, a long, long time. Time in memoriam, as my friends at the group, the New Red Order, call it. Time in memoriam. Anyway, so thinking about that and kind of researching the somewhat tedious but beautiful landscape painters, and thinking, you gotta get a grip on that. I also discovered that they were really largely responsible for one of the first political movements in art, which was the fact that they got people to identify with the landscape so much that the national park systems basically were developed to protect the land, and so I really thought about that as a kind of inspiration for what it is to be an artist and the way that artists work. That sometimes you go forward and you don't really know what the results are going to be, but you have to just keep going forward. And those painters who were a little bit out of step with what would be considered the avant-garde at the time, they were a bit more than a little bit out of step, actually had a great consequence in their work in that they developed people's consciousness to think about protecting the land. So, that kind of duality, I think, and it is an interesting jumping off point for looking at the culture along the Hudson. And I'm going to take poetic's license, as I said, which I'm going to take tons of poetic license. So don't take anything too seriously that I say here, because I'm going to make a leap and say that, we can connect that waterway all the way out here to the north and south forks of Long Island and to this room, in fact, and to the beginning of this exhibition, which, when we began talking about this as a kind of extension of that project and a kind of the tier of the cloud that Christina mentioned, I was thinking a lot about water as a metaphor for the way that we think about things, the way we believe in things, and a kind of trace for mythology, also sort of biochemical traces, and poetry, for lack of a better word. So this particular room, I'm going to talk about these pieces because I imagined a kind of, there's a lot of talk these days about global warming and the rising of sea levels, and I kind of was equating that to the debate around its existence and magical thinking and basically kind of telecommunications in the present day as a means of giving us a kind of wash of information, you know, thinking about people at a moment where you're able to, I mean, I grew up in an age where, you know, if somebody had the encyclopedia, it was a kind of big deal. So you'd go over to your friend's house and they'd have a World Book encyclopedia, and you'd go back to your house and say, like, Dad, like, what's up? You know, they have it, we don't have it, you know. And then you'd say, like, well, it's out of date, you know, it goes out of date every couple of years, so just go to the library and get it. But thinking about today, when you have that just at your fingertips, you know, and what that means to have any kind of amount of information at your fingertips, and how this has become a kind of struggle for people, because it's also a responsibility to live in this absolute deluge of information. And so these pieces, which were made with blown glass and resin and metal, kind of were my response to that. I was thinking about yeah, so I think I'll just leave it at that. But I thought maybe the way we'd do this is, since we're going to go into the next room, that we could have some questions about this room here. Does that make sense? So if people have questions, yeah.
Are you making the glass or the plexiglass also? Is this all made by you, or
Well,
collaborate with certain people?
I work with a great team at Urban Glass. If people are, yeah. So that's a local, you know, Hudson River School team of glassmakers in Brooklyn, and Bill Kogan was one of the main glass artists that I work with, and we got together. So what we would do is make a form and then take the molten glass out of the furnace and blow it in different ways, and then actually press it onto the surface of this, you know, without roasting it too much, and then letting it cool and then gluing it back into place.
It's very beautiful.
Thank you.
And the material that the holding shapes, the head shapes, or whatever you want to call them.
That's aqua resin.
This gentleman over here has just said something about the Four Noble Truths. Are you involved in Buddhism as well?
Well, no, I'm not, but I have plenty of friends who are.
Okay, because
Donnie.
Actors for the characters inside these things.
My friend Don Christensen asked the question, where do the actors come from? And the actors, their performers come from in these pieces. And a lot of times they're friends, other artists, performance artists, or just people I like the way they look or sound. And sometimes they're professional performers. I guess Jim Fletcher is featured over here, and Jason Scott Henderson over there. But as you might notice, we used a kind of morphing in the faces here, and I was thinking a lot about how, you know, in the information age, you pass ideas from one person to the next, and that we sort of take on characteristics of people we connect with in different ways. And I was trying to transmit that with these pieces, in the sense that as you're watching these faces, they'll use a computer morph, which is interpolation, they call it, a kind of algorithm which blends one face into the next. So the actors, it's not just one character. There, that one just changed to my friend Sakshi. And So I work with a lot of,
Is there a script or is it
Yeah.
improvised?
that's a great question. Is there a script? There is a script, for better or worse, with these pieces, and they're pretty much, I call them poems, but the way I work with them is I'll sort of layer them in the sense, almost like Don's a great musician, and I like to think of these almost musically, the way they combine in the room, in the sense that if you sort of listen to different parts, and then as so would have it that they kind of phase with each other because everything doesn't play like in one stream. So this one may go for 5 minutes, and in other words, they're playing at different times and they loop at different times so that they sort of recombine in different ways, which is an old kind of strategy for mixing things, but it gives it a kind of sense of rewriting itself is what I'm trying to get at. So in other words, the script is really, or the poems are really half there in the sense that my feeling is that you're going to finish the script in your head, if possible, you know. So I write along a kind of a line related to this particular project, as I mentioned, information overload, follow that along a path, and then recombine those different perspectives that I have in that, and then work them into the edit. So I start out one way, but then I kind of let the piece surprise me in a sense, you know.
This is just a technical question going back to how these pieces are constructed. I didn't understand how you did that.
You mean
The actual construction,
the-
the glass and the...
okay, so there's a question about how they're actually constructed. So we make a kind of like an egg form, like a head form, and then I would take out of resin. Yeah, it's a kind of, well, yeah, it's like a two-part solution that hardens up pretty hard with different layers. And then what I'll do is I then actually take that to the glass shop. So I'll have this big egg. And then at the glass shop, I'll say like, well, let's try this one because I thought I wanted each one of these to have a kind of different color, just somehow thinking about a way to organize them in a spectrum. And so it's like, well, let's try a purple, you know, we're going to do a purple today. And so we mix up the glass, and actually it's a kind of melted sand, if you can believe that. That's what glass is. So, and then you heat it up to, I don't know, over 1,000 degrees. I'm just going to make up a number. 10 million degrees. No, I think it's hot enough to melt. And so it comes together in this way, and then we use, then it gets weird because you use this thing called the glory hole. So you put you know, and then you turn it around, and then out it comes, and you blow air into it. It blows up into a bubble. We cut it, and then press it onto the egg. So you have like it's like a bubble that gets opened up and pressed onto the egg to have the effect that the thing is just dripping, you know, because I wanted it to look like something was just coming out of the sky and landed on the character, but that it was a little bit science fiction-y, you know, so it was transparent and was a little bit, so that's, if you work with glass, it's difficult to get things to look simple, and but they're really good at Urban Glass at doing that. So we spent a lot of time there with that. So when we were laying out the exhibition, you know, I thought of that room as a kind of more cerebral space, and then this room here would have a play between these two different elements, which are the ink blots and the robots, or the bots as I call them. And so I was thinking a lot about artificial intelligence and facial recognition, and there's a piece here that relates to facial recognition systems from a couple of years ago. I started a series. Are people familiar with facial recognition? Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. It's one of my favorite subjects in the past couple of years. And as I mentioned, I always develop my work through research, and that's where I get the ideas for the images or the texts or the installations. And so with this one, with facial recognition, when it first began, there were a lot of different companies competing with algorithms to figure out how to recognize one person's face out of the whole planet, to see what individual metrics were considered to be your identity, for lack of a better word. So, and the idea of kind of taking that and reducing it down to an algorithm that could be very quickly transposed onto someone's face. And of course, you know what I'm talking about. You go to the ATM, or you have your license or something like this, or you go to the airport, and these are the first uses of facial recognition. And first I was wondering, well, how does that happen? And the way that they're able to do it is to take a couple of cardinal points that theoretically, God willing, everybody has, and that don't actually change. Now, I know on my face they seem to have been changing quite a bit, but I like the idea that there's a few things that stay the same. I don't believe it, but there they are. There you have it. So a few things never change, and then they can say, okay, that's you, and these are your numbers, and this is the relationships of those points. But beyond that, that's a pretty amazing thing in itself. But beyond that, what makes that different than a portrait that came before that? Because I started to think, well, this is a portrait. This is a kind of new portrait. And okay, what's interesting about it is that it's being made by a machine. And it may be one of the first times that there is a portrait being made en masse of people by a machine. So it's a perspective, even though it's designed by humans, it's really a machine's way of looking at you. And what makes that different? Well, there's a couple of things that make that different. One is that, what does a machine think of you? Well, that's a good question right there. What do you think of the machine? And these questions start tumbling forth. One of the things that's fascinating about that is that it's not just the way you look anymore, because the machine doesn't really care about how you look, but it is the data collected around you that makes your portrait. So it's this kind of new portrait in the sense that it's connecting to a massive data sets that interconnect. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm talking about what you buy online, your economic profile, what things that you might watch on YouTube or Netflix or whatever, your educational history, or did I mention your financial, medical, blah, 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 all the stuff that's supposed to be private that, well, I guess it just leaks out of Facebook or gets hacked by somebody, and then actually it does get aggregated. That's the term they use, aggregation, for building this portrait. And I thought, well, that's pretty interesting in the sense that that's a new portrait, that it's not just about the way you look, it's about this information. And I started to think, well, that is kind of, it's worthy of making some paintings, some video paintings around that. And this piece here is one of those from a few years ago. And I worked on that for some years, and it was interesting that, there was a ramp up, because I obviously read some science magazines and things and try to keep up with tech. And now everybody knows about facial recognition. And so there's a kind of ramp up with that. What does it mean? That's the question. My work is not really about telling people what it means, but the idea of a machine looking back at you and you looking at a machine has inspired me for a long time. And I have a kind of approach to that here with some of the bots. And you've probably been reading about some of the bots that move their way around the internet. Have people read about that? Yeah, search engines, bots that go and do different things that target economics or politics or and the like. But also you have the other side of it, which is Siri. People know about Siri, and what are the other ones? There's Alexa, yeah. And Alex, is there an Alex too, or is it just Alexa? And so, I thought about how these characters would want to enter the world in different ways, because there was, if people watched 30 Rock a couple of years ago, there was a great thing called the Uncanny Valley, which is computer scientists from the 60s talked about how eventually there'll be a robot that will become more and more like us. And this is a metaphor, because in the 60s, people started to think, well, the robots are going to look like us. Well, it turns out that really the robots look like the internet, which doesn't look like anything. It just looks like a bunch of stuff flying around on the screen. But that's really, in my mind, is the kind of offloading of consciousness that Kurzweil and media theorists talk about in terms of future AI. And so if you want to say where the digital mirror of humanity is right now, it's obviously on the internet, because we have, if you imagine ahead and you think about the early days of psychology, you would look at this thing they called phrenology. Everybody know about phrenology? It's a kind of humorous and beautiful thing where people represented, they would say like romance is here, and violence is here, and bliss is here, and so forth on the head. And we, that's one of the early depictions of isolating human consciousness and looking at it, followed by Freud and Jung and all the other wonderful people who have explored consciousness. But today, I say I put my money on the internet as a pretty much a mirror of consciousness. But I still like the idea of a machine somehow gaining its independence and relating to us in different ways. So I designed these bots, which they look a bit like puppets that have bubble heads and faces, which are kind of composite faces. And I wanted to think about, what they might say and do. They pretty much hang out and try to convince you of various things. And the idea is that eventually they'll probably become, they'll have artificial intelligently triggered responses in them, which we're working on feverishly in the studio. But right now they're just randomly edited to give the illusion of that artificial intelligence. And so then if we're thinking about artificial intelligence and what might become of it, it's also, as an artist, I think one of the more important things is to think about what it is to be human and what would separate us from machines and so forth. Because there's a lot of, right now, the impulse is to kind of look at how we can be quantified, but I want to look at how we can't be quantified. And one of the things that's really wonderful to me is the ink blot. And it's been, people probably know about the ink blot because of the famous Rorschach test, which I think was in the 1950s. And, but before that, if you look at, there's some antecedents. There was a parlor game that was designed called The Ghost of My Friends, where people would sign a piece of paper with an old quill ink pen and fold it together and open it back up, and it would turn into a kind of figurative form. And so if you look back, people like even Da Vinci was fooling around with ink blots. And of course, the wonderful Andy Warhol, who you can see, I think it's still up at the Whitney, has ink blots. And so I wanted to kind of look at ink blots because what it seems to me that what separates us from machines, and I think, and I value more and more, is creativity in general. And of course, machines can do things which are creative, but I think that they'll never really be able to replace our collective creativity and what it is to dream as a human and what it is to invent. So these pieces, you know, as I mentioned in the other room, I always think about you completing the artwork, which probably a lot of people say is their strategy, but I kind of believe that in a lot of ways, that what separates art from popular culture is that in this institution, your opinion and your point of view is valued, whereas if you go down the street to see Midsummer, which I'm going to do really soon with my son, they don't really care about your opinion. You're just there for a roller coaster ride. And the difference between pop culture and art is that you're part of the picture. Like, the work really doesn't exist without you. So these pieces, these Rorschachs, or ink blot pieces, are about kind of trying to provoke your imagination in a literal, anatomical way and a figurative, poetic way. So we experimented with this one is projected here, and these obviously have video screens embedded in them. And so these are, I think it's maybe one of the first times they've been shown in a group anywhere, and we're excited to have them here. So I think I'll leave it at that in here and ask people to, if they have any questions. Yeah.
Does your embedded screen, for instance, add picture, does it have all those colors? Like, do you work with the video sort of into the template of it, or are you using gel or any other kind of?
That's a good question. So just a technical question about how these were made color-wise. What I would do is, actually there are two different panels. So there are two different panels that are prepared like a painting. And so I put paint on them and fold them together and open them back up and hope that I get an interesting enough image to then cut out holes in it, mount screens behind it, and then work with the computer to fill those screens with different images which kind of complete the composition. So what happens is we use a computer to feed into the screen behind it and then place the images in it using a various programs like After Effects, and it's a kind of like Photoshop for the moving image, if people know Photoshop. But it's basically collage with video.
So are there a number of different videos running, or is this one solid video per panel?
It's two different screens behind it, and then in there could be as many as 50 different videos stuck into it or something like that, depending. So they're really labor intensive, and
A lot of work.
yeah, it's a labor intensive process, and but hopefully. Any other questions? Donnie has one.
These little screens, are they like phone screens or like little
Well,
digital cameras?
the way these are done, in there, yeah, those are. I'm actually not sure what those are from, but they're what their original purpose was. Probably phones, but there's companies that mass produce those, and they're sold through. If people are familiar with Adafruit and these, they're companies that make parts for computers that are quite inexpensive to be put together for a little computer. So the idea, it's a great thing. So somebody could make a synthesizer or a little computer with a tiny little keyboard like this big that you can use. And the idea is you can make an entire computer for like $150 or $120 that can even go on the internet. But it's also, they're used for educational purposes and things, but why they made those particular screens, I'm not sure. They're basically for the, computer, some kind of computer purpose, probably for phones and, yeah.
I got a question.
Oh, yeah.
You know, just out of curiosity, because the technology that you're using, over time, perception of it changes. And to take something like facial recognition and some of the other stuff you're dealing with now has a dark side. You know, that's not as much fun. And that comes over time when you look at the pieces. You begin, like when I saw facial recognition 5 years ago, I would have had a different reaction than today. Are you trying to address, are you thinking about?
That's a great question. Let me, Okay. So the question was, what about the dark side of the technology and the negative side of it? I think it's really important to me that people interrogate the technology that they live with and figure out ways to use it creatively as best as possible. And so there could be, in a sense, a kind of meta interaction with the technology. So these scripts that I write and some of the dialogue around it has to do with privacy, with identity, with the kind of politics around facial recognition. But there's also another message which is important to me, which is that it's using that technology to critique itself or to bring it into a level of art and creativity. So I'm always curious about how the next generation can work with, for example, video gaming and the internet in general, because as we know, the phone that you have now is probably 10,000 times more powerful than the computer that took us to the moon. And what are people using it for? So people have those tools, but the problem is it's whether you use it for consumption or creation and the balance between the two. So I am interested in, yeah. So that's my message in the sense is that it's not really to expose the underside of technology, because people are aware of that and there's a dialogue around it and we kind of forget. And then what I like to say is that, you know, by the time we really sort of understand one technology, we're already in the next one. So, for example, I keep going back to television, the generation of television. You know, I grew up watching more television, or my generation watched more television than they did anything except sleep. But I can't say I've read one good book about that, except for maybe Jonathan Daschle's book called The Storytelling Animal, which talks about, he's an evolutionary sociologist who deals with narrative. And so he talks about how narrative works in human evolution, which is a kind of great perspective on it. I don't think he really understands art, but he had some great things to say about how narrative functions and how it's important for us to use it to kind of test things out. You know, he uses the example of Grimm's fairy tales and how Grimm's fairy tales are often seen as very violent, you know. But he says also that kids, like very little kids, even a 3-year-old might have very violent fantasies and make up stories. But that's normal that people use that as a way of problem solving. And it's part of our evolution to kind of enact these things and work through them in a safe environment in technology. So we're evolving these technologies to connect with our psyche in ways that we don't even know yet. They're happening in real time. But that book is called The Storytelling Animal. Jonathan Daschle is his name, I think, if I have the pronunciation right. But ignore him when it comes to anything having to do with art, because I'm sure if he read like William Burroughs or A Fractured Narrative, he's going to hate it. So we have to educate him in terms of art, but in terms of evolutionary sociology in relation to narrative, he's aces, you know. But I don't think he really understands what's happening now yet.
I couldn't hear, sorry, when you said the name of the company that you get the little screens from?
There's Adafruit is the name, and if you have trouble finding it, you can get my email through the museum, and we'll have the studio send it. But there's a place called I can't remember, but yeah, Adafruit. Yeah, okay. Like Adafruit, like you ate an apple. So it's and.
I just wanted to jump in because the opening's starting.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we're starting to. I just wanted to thank everyone so much and thank Tony. I'm Andrea Grover. I'm the director here at Guildhall, and I think we can continue talking with Tony in a more informal way since people are starting to arrive for the opening. So,
thanks, Andrea.